All right, so this is what every Christian should know about church history. Not obviously the history of this church, but the history of the church, the universal church, going back to the beginning. And so there is much that could be covered. And since we've only got 6 hours or less in which to work, we're obviously condensing things significantly. Now, the primary text that I worked through when organizing my thoughts for this seminar is this one right here. Diarmaid MacCulloch, he's a well-known historian. It's called Christianity, the First 3,000 Years. Obviously, he's going back into the Jewish era a ways to start telling the story, and it's 1,000 pages long. But this 1,000-page book is obviously skipping significant people, events, ideas, and covering other ones in a paragraph or a page or two, because of course it's 2,000 plus years of history to be covered. So thinking about that, when I was putting this together, I decided to focus on vignettes, on moments, on ideas, on people that have a big impact, an impact that continues into the modern era, so that we would hopefully understand the story best. Somebody asked me recently when I was talking about putting this one on again, what is the biggest omission? And I thought about that for a little bit. What is the biggest person or idea or event that is left out of this? And my conclusion was that it was Thomas Aquinas. I want to actually talk about Thomas Aquinas other than right here, right now. And he's a hugely important figure in the church, but there's a lot of those. And the only person that has their own segment is of course, St. Augustine. We'll be getting to him today. So let's dig in, starting, of course, with the early church, because we start at the beginning. The picture there showing one of the earliest churches. Of course, the early church buildings are nothing like our buildings today, because the story doesn't start with buildings, but with people. So let's start with that story. And it begins with eyewitnesses. The story of the church begins in the generation of those that were alive that saw the events of the New Testament. The apostles, the disciples, and the people that they witnessed to, the people of Judea, the people that saw these things firsthand. During that generation, right, that first generation, churches were established, and of course, even beyond Judea. It didn't take long at all for them to go beyond Judea into Samaria, into the Greek cities, and then of course into Asia Minor, and Greece, and Italy, and North Africa, and beyond, with Paul leading the charge there and having primarily Gentile converts. Some converts within Judaism to Jesus as the Messiah, but primarily people who had not been connected that well to Judaism before. And these churches were being established, these converts were being found throughout the Roman Empire by the end of that first generation, as far away as Spain, and even beyond the empire, into the Parthian Empire, as far perhaps as India, if Thomas did indeed make it to India, all during that first generation. It's important to note that because the eyewitnesses were still alive during that generation to give direction, correction, as of course the confrontation between Peter and Paul that we see in the New Testament. And most of that history is told to us, and what we know about it is primarily contained in the book of Acts, and what we glean from the letters that Paul wrote to the churches, or that Peter wrote, or James wrote. We're glean most of what we know from that. While that is happening, one of the most important and impactful things that happens during that first generation is the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. And with it, the loss of the second temple, the loss of the temple that had been built under Ezra and Nehemiah, had been massively renovated under Herod. So the temple building itself is lost, and the entire precinct, basically. The Sanhedrin is no more, and most of that leadership. The sacrificial system, the priestly sacrificial system for Passover and the Day of Atonement and all of the other festivals and all of the other occasions that people would have come to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice for sin or for praise, or for Thanksgiving, that's ended. And a huge number of Hebrew manuscripts, scrolls, were lost. Notably, the majority of Jewish Christians fled before the siege of Jerusalem. They were not involved in this warfare against Rome. They were not the partisans that were pushing it forward. And so they left. They got out of town. They went beyond there. The Jewish war lasted from AD 66 to 73. And of course, it famously ends with the mass suicide of the remaining rebels at the siege of Masada. Our primary source for this time period is the Jewish War, that's the name of it, by Josephus. He used to be a rebel. When he was captured by the Romans, he decided he knew where his bread was buttered, as so to speak, and he wrote his account, which is a very pro-Roman account, and you have to, of course, take that with a grain of salt when you're reading it, that he's writing an account that the Romans are going to like, because he knows that's in his best interest. So the destruction of Jerusalem, the war, adds to the diaspora. But actually, by 70 AD, before the war, there were already more Jews living outside of Judea than inside of it. It also leads to a shift of Gentile leadership of the church. That was probably inevitable. You read the book of Acts, you see how many more converts were happening that were Gentile versus Jewish. We start with a church that is almost exclusively Jewish, right, on the day of Pentecost. But as you read the book of Acts, you see that it's shifting, and the percentages are tilting more and more towards Gentile members of the larger church. So it's only inevitable that leadership will eventually, second generation, third generation, at some point be primarily Gentile. The war accelerates all that, right, by bringing an end to the Jerusalem church, which until that point had a leadership role. After this, noteworthy for the region is the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 136. It's actually a lot worse than the more famous war, the one that destroyed Jerusalem, or at least the temple. In that war, up to 500,000 Jewish civilians in Judea were killed. So basically, the entire province was depopulated of its Jewish population. There will not be a majority in Judea that is Jewish until 2,000 years later, until the Zionist movement, the modern Zionist movement, when Jews start coming back from Europe and elsewhere. The province, the area, will be primarily Gentile for the next 2,000 years. It's not part of the church history story, but it's a fascinating piece of the larger history that we are connected to. The revolt was 132 to 136. They obviously thought that the last go-around they could do better, but they were sadly mistaken. The Romans crushed them even worse this time. So, what do we have by the end of the first century? By the end of that first generation going into the second one, all the texts that would later be recognized as part of the New Testament canon had already been written. They had already been copied, some of them many times, and they'd already been dispersed. There were copies of these texts in North Africa, in Italy, in Greece, every which where, and more copies being made all the time. Of course, I talk about that quite extensively in the History of the Bible seminar. We're touching primarily just a little bit on canon in this moment. The limits of canon, what belongs in the New Testament, which writings are in, which writings are out, would not be generally recognized. It would not be formalized until the end of the second century. But the idea that there is a new divine written text, that God has authored something new, that it is inspired, that it is authoritative, because we've got a new covenant, so we've got a new text. That idea was well established. By the end of the first century, people had already, in the church, recognized that there is a new authoritative text out there. They just were not yet all on the same page about what was in it. Let me give you a couple of examples of where we see that. They're listed there. 2 Peter 3:16. This is within the New Testament text. This is Peter writing. He says he writes the same way in all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the other scriptures to their own destruction. In that text, Peter is talking about the Apostle Paul and his letters, and he equates them to the other scriptures. So there we see Peter treating the writings of Paul as authoritative. 1 Timothy 5:18. This is Paul writing then. For Scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. Now the first one is from Deuteronomy 25:4. No surprise at all that the Apostle Paul would call Deuteronomy Scripture. But the second quote, the worker deserves his wages, is from Luke 10:7. So there we see Paul calling the Gospel of Luke Scripture, equating it with the Hebrew Scriptures. Then we jump to the early church fathers for a few other examples. 1 Clement 47:1-3. All of these are written somewhere between the end of that first generation and the middle 100s. It's hard to pin them exactly down. The earliest date for the next four examples is 70, and the latest date is 140. So they're in that time frame, that second generation. So Clement writes, take up the epistle of the blessed Paul the apostle. What wrote he first unto you in the beginning of the gospel? Of a truth he charged you in the Spirit concerning himself and Cephas and Apollos, because that even then ye had made parties. That translation, of course, is old-timey. So here we have Clement quoting 1 Corinthians 1:12 and saying that Paul wrote that in the Spirit. Authority of the Holy Spirit, that's an important thing. Another text is called the Didache. It is one of the first known catechisms. We don't know who wrote it. We're not exactly sure where it begins, but the church was using it as a catechism, as something to teach new converts about their faith. And in the catechism it says, this is chapter 8, verse 2, neither pray ye as the hypocrites, but as the Lord hath commanded in his gospel, so pray ye our Father in heaven. And so it quotes the prayer that Jesus taught us, of course, quoted in the Gospels, and says, as the Lord commanded in his gospel. So giving credence to the Gospels. Ignatius chapter 12, this is the Bishop Ignatius of Antioch, an important man in church history, says, let me skip down here. You are initiated into the mysteries of the gospel with Paul, the holy, the martyred, the deservedly most happy, at whose feet may I be found when I shall attain to God, who in all his epistles makes mention of you in Christ Jesus. So Ignatius is talking about learning from Paul, about soaking up Paul's knowledge, and about his epistles, about all of his writings. And then Polycarp, we got two more, wrote Philippians 12:1, not the same Philippians as Paul. Here he writes, I trust that you are well versed in the sacred scriptures, and that nothing's hidden from you, but to me this privilege is not yet granted. It's declared then in these scriptures, be ye angry and sin not, and let not the sun go down upon your wrath. So he quotes first Psalm 4:4, normal, and then he quotes Ephesians 4:26, equating that with Scripture. And then lastly, Barnabas 4:14. We don't know the author of this, but the letter of Barnabas was contained in Codex Sinaiticus. It says this, moreover, understand this also, my brothers, when ye see that after so many signs and wonders wrought in Israel, even then they were abandoned, let us give heed, lest haply we be found, as the Scripture saith, many are called, but few are chosen. Of course, that's Matthew 22:14, and there we have once again a portion of the Gospels being talked of as Scripture. So that's the very first generation, the quotes from the New Testament authors. The second generation, where we see people referring to pieces of what will eventually be the New Testament canon as authoritative, as inspired by the Spirit, etc., etc. And there's other such examples. If you're interested in the topic, let me recommend The Canon of Scripture. I took the dust jacket off because I hate those things. By F.F. Bruce. This is from 1988. I actually was going to do a seminar on the canon. I read this book and 2 other books and did about 30 pages of notes, and then realized that if I did a seminar on the canon, no one would show up. They would be bored because it's very technical once you really dive into it. A lot of people, a lot of quotes, a lot of dates, so I let that go. But this is an excellent book. He's a extremely well-known authority on the subject. So we've got the canon forming, right? End of the first generation, into the second generation, people are determining by their usage, by the authority of that text, what belongs in the canon, and eventually it will get codified by councils. What's happening in the larger picture? All right, we went from the eyewitnesses, and now we have a written text. All of the eyewitnesses are now gone. Now we're in the second generation, the third generation. What's happening? At this point, we have the church as a persecuted minority within the empire, starting off as a very small minority in the first generation, growing as time goes on, but still a minority and still on the outside looking in. The Romans had an official policy that said everyone in the empire must in some way show allegiance to the cult of emperor worship. This is not, of course, early empire when it was still a republic, but later on, after the Caesars took hold, it was a way of showing the authority of Rome. They didn't really care what you did with your religion otherwise. Just show us that you worship the emperor in some way, shape, or form, and you're good to go. Fascinatingly, Judaism had an exemption to that. It had been agreed upon generations before. If you were Jewish, you were exempt from this. It didn't stop them from revolting twice. They still were not happy with Rome. But of course, Christianity is more and more Gentile every year, less and less Jewish. It can hardly say, we want the Jewish exception, right? We want that Judaism exemption thing. We're still applying for that when it's not very well connected anymore. Initially, persecution within the empire was localized. One provincial governor, one centurion. It was haphazard. The most famous example in this early era would be Nero's pogrom in Rome, right after the Great Fire in AD 64, when Nero persecuted both Jews and Christians in response to that. Why did the empire have an issue with Christians when they didn't have issues with other religious minorities? A couple of reasons. Christians generally had a negative attitude toward serving in the Roman army. All right? They were not interested in public religious festivals, refusing to participate in their local pagan ones. Now, that's pretty obvious in the 2nd, 3rd century. If you live in a town and there's a big festival to the local pagan god and you are not participating, you stick out like a sore thumb. All right? And of course, they kept insisting that their claims of truth were universal, that what they had was really for everyone, that they were sharing a message that everyone should listen to and accept. That was different than Judaism. Largely, Judaism did not proselytize. Some people became converts to Judaism. Some people attached themselves to a local synagogue because they either liked the ethics or they liked the ritual, but they didn't go out sending missionaries out. That wasn't their style. That just wasn't the way Judaism operated. Christianity, of course, very different in that respect, especially in these early generations, and so they are rubbing people in power the wrong way. Polycarp of Smyrna, that's where he was from, is the first Christian that we have record of him being burned alive. 155 AD. This is the beginning of a special reverence for martyrs, because anyone could become a martyr. Man or woman, slave or free, rich or poor, right? You could end up as a martyr if persecution came your way and you stood up for your faith. And that status becomes something in the early church of great reverence. Eventually, as persecution ends, this will shift towards hermits, people that these holy ascetics, these interesting fellows, primarily living out in the desert and whatnot. And then after that, it will take another shift towards monks and nuns in monasticism. We'll talk about monasticism next week. So by the end of the 2nd century, Christianity is widespread enough and established enough to offer an alternative culture to Rome and thus become a threat to the empire. Once you start offering an alternative path that people are starting to recognize and see and become familiar with, the empire is not going to appreciate that, and so persecution is going to start to become more organized, more purposeful. The empire itself, during this time period, is undergoing nasty civil war after civil war. Claimants to the throne are involving their legions that are loyal to them, and Roman armies are clashing against each other. It is a rough time in the empire's history. There are border wars. There are incursions of outside peoples into the empire. And the empire is becoming more and more dependent upon the army to survive. Without the Roman army, the government cannot survive, which, of course, the more you head in that direction, your government becomes a police state, right? Where the military has the power, where they can depose an emperor, where they can put a new one on the throne, which is, of course, what they ended up doing. Many of the later emperors are generals who use their army to seize the throne. In AD 202, the Emperor Septimus Severus, sounds like a character from Harry Potter, Septimus Severus issues an edict banning all conversion to Christianity or Judaism. It's now illegal. Of course, it will last as long as he's the emperor, and then the next emperor might have a whole different idea about this, but this is an example of what's coming. Here we are heading towards one of the biggest eras of persecution. So let's look at this. Now the emperor is Trajan Decius in 250, so we're 50 years later than the last guy. He required that every household get a certificate proving that they had sacrificed to the old gods or to the emperor, to the Roman gods, the Greek gods, or the Egyptians gods, something like that, and the emperor. You had to have a piece of paper, a piece of papyrus saying this, and if you refused, you're going to jail, or you're going to be killed on the spot. And this policy will continue for 10 years. Fascinatingly, the early church identified this certificate with the mark of the beast that John writes about in the book of Revelation. That for them was the kind of thing that John was talking about. When I was arguing with people online about the COVID-19 vaccine and their ideas that it was the mark of the beast, I said, you don't know anything about what the early church thought the mark of the beast was. This is the kind of thing they were talking about. Any which way, that's a side note. During this 10-year period, the bishops of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Rome were all executed for defying the law. 3 of the most important cities in Christianity, all of their bishops killed. During this 10-year period, most Christians, and of course statistics are hard to come by, but most Christians obeyed the law. Some of them became genuine apostates, right? They left the faith and they never came back. Some of them went through the motions in order to not go to jail or not die. They didn't mean it, but they did it so they could get the certificate, and some of them bribed a local official, right? I won't do it, but here's however much it takes to bribe the local commander. You sign it anyway, and that's how they got out of it. There was a minority who refused. They became known as confessors because they confessed Jesus when put to it. And after this emperor, when things calmed back down, they were reluctant to welcome back into church the people they called the lapsed, the people that had either become apostate or gone through the motions or bribed an official. They said basically, you guys are out. We were here when it was ugly. Where were you? And so now there's tension between these two groups. After we get done with this section, we'll stop for questions. So let me finish about the persecution. Persecution led to increased authority of the bishops. Now that makes sense because we're in turmoil. We're looking for leadership. We're looking for answers in hard questions. And bishops are guys that seem to have some of those. Bishop Cyprian of Carthage argues at this point that only a bishop can forgive the sins of someone who lapsed. He puts forth the idea that if you are one of these lapsed people, you can be forgiven, but you got to come to me. Or of course, your local bishop, whoever that happens to be. Those who believed that you could forgive the lapsed were set against those who believed that you could not. In AD 272, taking a step aside from the persecution for a moment, this is a noteworthy event, is the first time that the church asked the Roman emperor to involve himself in a dispute. The bishop of Antioch refused to leave his post. I don't know why they wanted to get rid of him. I don't know if it was good, bad, or otherwise for him to leave, but they said, we can't solve this. Emperor, will you get involved? That is an interesting step to take. It was Aurelian was the emperor at the time. In 303 to 305, we have the last great persecution coming from Rome. The emperor then was Diocletian. He also persecuted the Manichaeans. It wasn't just the Christians that he was against. The Manichaeans, we'll talk about them more a bit later, but anybody that disrespected the traditional gods, the old gods, Diocletian went after him. Now, it only lasted 3 years, but 1/2 of all early church martyrs were killed during those 3 years. So while other persecution lasts, 5 years, 10 years, or longer, while it's spread out over more than a century, these 3 years were the reign of terror. When it ends, when his time as emperor ends, that dispute between the people that confessed and the people that lapsed comes back with a vengeance. Now it's even a bigger issue and a bigger fight because, of course, this time more people had refused. That's why there were so many martyrs. The first time there weren't as many martyrs because people said, okay, I'm not going to get killed over this. But this time, a lot more people were a generation later. They said, forget it, we'd rather die. And Diocletian's government said, that's fine with us. Killed him. Let's pause for a minute before we talk about the change under Constantine and see if there are any questions that have jumped up into your head thus far while I get a drink of water.
I have a question.
Yep.
When you're starting to talk about, you talked about Cyprian.
Mm-hmm.
He was a bishop, and he would rather be that only bishop.
Right. Could forgive the lapsed. Yes.
Thank you. When did bishops start coming on the scene? I'm wondering because
Right.
the early Jewish or the early Christian churches wouldn't have.
So the idea of the progression from pastor to bishop to a patriarch, someone who is a bishop of bishops, is a very early development. It is not something we have a lot of evidence about because it's in that first generation after the eyewitnesses, right, where we start seeing, I read, let me flip back, Clement was a bishop in Rome. I quoted him. Ignatius was a bishop in Antioch. Polycarp was a bishop in Smyrna. So three of the five that I quoted to you when talking about the canon, those were bishops. And they were all living during that second to third generation, from the 70s, 80s to the 130s, 140s. That's when they were around, and they were already established in that role with that larger authority, obviously more than one church under their leadership. Usually it was in larger urban settings. You know, the bishop of Alexandria, the bishop of Antioch, a city that would have multiple churches in it. By that second generation, we start to see bishops there.
So is there a model that's from the Jewish?
No, it's their interpretation of what Paul said about overseers and elders and bishops and all of that stuff. And of course, we know if you study that, sometimes he's using the words interchangeably between elder and bishop, and we're confused. Paul, what exactly are you saying? That's what they took it to mean. And it was a fairly organic development because it's happening all over these areas, and there's not a overarching structure yet. We're nowhere near in that second generation an overarching structure that would answer for the whole church or direct the whole church. That is, and we'll get to that, that's not until the great councils 150, 200 years after this starts to happen. And yet we see that very early on that the church went to that model. And then eventually after that, you start seeing what we would call patriarchs, people like in a major city like Alexandria or like Ephesus or later on Constantinople or like Rome that would say, since I'm the bishop here, I have some authority over all of the bishops in my whole region, not just my whole city. And you end up with half a dozen of those guys by the end of the second century. That's really developing and becoming a thing. But again, no, they don't have a group. They don't work together per se. They're not organized in any way. It's just it's a natural development. Because it was a time of chaos, when there was persecution, it was a time of establishing things, and people were looking for someone to have authority, right? Someone to answer the hard questions, someone to appeal to when you have an argument. We need somebody, and so that's the kind of thing that we start seeing develop. I got to find which page I flipped back. Here's the page that I was on, and you had a question too. Yes. Cyprian of Carthage, another important city then.
That seems like a pretty bold statement for a human to make.
It does. The question was about their chutzpah, I guess you could use the Jewish word, the Yiddish, to say that I'm the one that has to forgive the lapsed. Again, keep in mind that this is an existential crisis, right? This is no small thing when your churches are being ransacked, when Bibles are being burned, when people are being mauled and murdered and thrown in prison. And so there was much fear, there was much anger, there was much, all sorts of that emotional stuff. And it's not surprising that they would argue locally about who could come back. When things die down and we can start holding public worship services again, wherever they were holding them, then you're going to be saying, wait, what are you coming back for? Where have you been? All right, think of them like, to an extent, like a deserter from the army. If a deserter comes back after the battle, who has the authority to say whether or not they can come back to the army? Probably just the general, right? Not the lieutenant, not their sergeant. That's not a perfect example, and I'm trying to think of one on the fly. But it was by no means an argument that ended. And we will delve into the consequences of that. That is a big argument coming real soon. So give me another page or two and we'll be talking about that argument once again. However, the persecution didn't last forever because a massively important event changes everything in that respect, and that has to do with the new emperor. In 306, Constantius I died. The army said, you know what? His son would be a great emperor. Constantine, you're the new emperor. However, of course, other armies said, no, we want our general to be the emperor, and so they fought it out. And yet another Roman civil war. In AD 312, so 6 years later, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, against his rival claimant, a man named Maxentius, another general, Constantine's troops went into that battle with their shields painted with, and the symbol is there on the left-hand side, with the Chi Rho, as it is called, painted on their shields. It's basically the first two letters in Greek of the word Christ, our CH and our R. And so they superimposed them, they painted them on their shields because he told them, this is what we need to do to win. Where did he get that idea from? Constantine said at the time, and later it was enshrined, of course, as part of the official story of how he won the war, that before the battle, he had had a vision. He had had a dream, and in his dream he saw the cross up in the sky, and he heard the voice say, conquer by this. Use this sign to conquer. And so they did that, and they won. Now, of course, one of the great unanswerable questions is, where did that come from? Did Constantine actually see this? Was it a real vision? And if it was, did it come from God? We can't answer that. Because, of course, we weren't there to know, and even if we were there, it was only in his head, so I have absolutely no idea if God actually did that or not, or if that was something cynical that Constantine did. He wins the battle, wins the war, becomes emperor. 1 year later, in AD 313, you have the Edict of Milan, in which toleration of Christians and non-Christians is equalized. In other words, it's not illegal anymore. He didn't make Christianity favored, he just said it's not illegal anymore. But of course, that would have been a big relief to the people that for generations had lived under the persecution and the illegality and the threat and the constant fear of something new happening. Personally, there is much debate about Constantine's faith and whether or not it was genuine. You have people convinced it was. You have people that will never believe it was. It seems as if it was, at least to him, genuine. Fascinatingly, he waited to be baptized until he knew he was dying. Because in his mind, he said, I've done a lot of bad things in my life. I've killed a lot of people, right? I mean, becoming Roman emperor he waded through a lot of blood to get there. And he wanted to make sure that when he died, all his sins would have just been washed away, lest he screw up and start sinning again after he's baptized and risk it. Now, the theology there is pretty messed up, but that's where Constantine's head was on it, and eventually he was baptized. We know that during his reign, he commissioned 50 Bibles to be copied. You might be thinking, you're the emperor. 50? 50 is a huge expense in that day and age. It is likely, and we talk about these two, of course, in great detail in the History of the Bible seminar, that Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus were two of those Bibles. Because they're from that time period. They would have been very expensive to have been made when they were. Other things that Constantine did, the other thing that we know him for, and the reason his name is familiar, is that he founded a new capital for the Eastern Empire and took the town that was already there and said, I dub thee Constantinople, right? We'll name it after me. Ancient guys loved naming things after themselves. There's like 30 Alexandrias in the ancient world. And so that will become the Eastern Empire and a big part of the story of the East later on. In 380, so in 313, Christianity was no longer illegal. In 380, the new emperor at that time, Theodosius I, issues what is known as the Edict of Thessalonica, and now Christianity is the official religion of the empire. 380. So in 312, it was illegal. In 313, it became legal. Fast forward to 380, and now it's official. So that is fast, all right? That is a quick change of fortune in respect to what the government, which of course the Roman Empire is the government of the time, right? to empire of most of the civilized world in their mind. And yet now we are officially, they would say, now we've got the backing of the empire. It's a very abrupt turnaround. After, of course, their grandparents or their great-grandparents were going in the arena to be slaughtered, being burned at the stake, and now they've got the official stamp of approval from the empire. So it's quite a abrupt turn. And of course, there are many implications of that will pile up as time wears on. Any questions about Constantine and the Edict Milan and all of that stuff?
Just a comment?
Yep.
Maybe. Just see the hand of God in this. I
Well-
believe that we saw that. Why would he do the guy?
That is a fascinating question, isn't it? Why would Constantine do that if it wasn't a genuine vision? But we have no way of testing that, right? We know that he gave Nebuchadnezzar visions. He gave and others as well in the Old Testament. Maybe indeed he did. I don't know, right? I have no idea, because we don't know what the future of the church would have been if it continued to be illegal under the empire, right? Now, we know that the Roman Empire's days were numbered no matter what, especially in the West. What would have happened next? Nope, we can't know that. We can't possibly know what would have happened to know whether or not. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of rabbit trails you can go down with this, right? If you say it was the hand of God to make the Christianity the official religion of the empire, then you have to answer the question: was that a blessing or was that a punishment? Being the official religion of the empire, was that because God was happy with them or because God was upset with them? And you can make an argument either way. And make it convincing if you want to debate those two sides of that coin. So any which way, one brief side note, because I came across this and I find it to be interesting because we would have never have thought of this. The art of the early church. Just a quick rabbit trail. How did the early church depict Jesus when they depicted him? Almost universally, they depicted him as either an infant, which I find awesome because that's how Ricky Bobby likes to see Jesus, as little tiny baby Jesus. And if you've never seen Talladega Nights, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But if you have, that's his favorite Jesus. Or during his life, doing miracles, the Sermon on the Mount, that kind of thing. The early church never drew or made art of Jesus hanging on the cross. That will become the primary depiction of Jesus in the Middle Ages, but in the early church they never did it. That just wasn't. We don't have any extant, any art that survived that would show that. And since we don't have any, it seems pretty likely they didn't, or very, very rarely did. So that is an interesting, to me, little tidbit. Let's take a look at a map. Maps are awesome. This is the spread of Christianity over time. We have the time of Irenaeus, 185. So that would be the end of that time period where I quoted those different bishops talking about the canon. Just after that, you've got North Africa, Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, of course, Judea, and then Egypt. But notice by the time of Constantine in 325, all of the green added. What does that map look like? That looks like the map of Rome. That's the whole empire, all right? Plus the east, the green, I need my pointer. This green over here is beyond the empire. This is the Parthian Empire. And so they're beyond it. They're into England. They're into France, what will eventually be France, of course, Spain. That 140 years, massive growth during that time period. What was happening then? Those were the big spates of persecution. All right? Now, you don't take that one thing and say persecution caused it, right? Because that would be a leap from the evidence. But you can look at that and say that despite the persecution, despite the best efforts of the empire, in a few very brutal moments that lasted years, maybe even a decade, to wipe Christianity out or to curtail it fatally, they failed spectacularly, right? Diocletian and all the rest failed because when all was said and done, it was still there and it was still growing. So that is the first segment on the early church. Any last questions or thoughts about the early church? That was, again, super fast, right? We're talking about the early church for about 40 minutes when we just covered 300 years.
This spread of Christianity,
Yep.
the Roman Empire, it just seems God's Holy Spirit.
Oh, absolutely.
And God wants Christianity.
Well, so the question is that can you see the work of the Holy Spirit in all this? Of course you can, because of the overcoming of the lack of organization, right? The lack of power, the presence of persecution, the lack of resources. I mean, if you're trying to say how does something go from here to there, and you were trying to do it on human terms, you'd be saying, okay, what's our strategy? What are our resources? What can we bring to bear on this? And you'd look at this and say, oh, this isn't going to work, right? What have we got? We got a whole lot of nothing. And it would seem impossible. Remember that the religions that they're supplanting, right, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Egyptian gods, these go back into antiquity. They were still in antiquity. They go back into the pre-writing, right? They go back to the very beginnings of history. These religions had been there a long time. And to basically wipe them out, not with the sword, but by supplanting their ideas and converting their followers so quickly, it certainly means something. There's a lesson there. Now, no religion can say they spread this far, this fast, except Islam. The difference being, of course, that in the century plus that Islam does this, almost the entirety of the spread is by the sword. Whereas none of this is, right? Because until the time of Constantine, the Christians had no military power. They didn't conquer anyone. They didn't subdue anyone, right? They were on the other end of the sword, not the wielder, the receiver. So when you're comparing the spread of early Christianity with the spread of Islam, it's an apples and oranges conversation because the technique, the strategy is completely different. Something worth noting. It is therefore easily the fastest peaceful spread of any new religion in world history. Now, the peaceful spread part, that part of the story is going to start coming to an end because we're going to start seeing some of the spread by the sword in later history. But of course, before Constantine, that never happened. So let's talk about the character nature of that early church. And one of the things that we have to talk about then is the idea of orthodoxy, correct belief, all right, versus heresy, right? The conflict between those two. So prior to the Edict of Milan, which of course made Christianity legal in 313, we just talked about that, the Orthodox Church leadership, in other words, I'm using that word not with the capital O as in Eastern, but what the word means. The word orthodox means straight opinion in Greek. So if you are orthodox, your opinions are straight, your beliefs are correct, they're right, they're good. And so the Orthodox Church, right, those who represented correct theological understanding of the gospel and the scriptures and Jesus and salvation, etc., up until that point, they had absolutely no power to marginalize heretics. So if you were a heretic that was trying to promote a different idea of Jesus, a different understanding of the gospel, the church couldn't do much at all about you, right? They've got no courts, they've got no army, they've got no magistrates, they've got nothing to enforce their decisions on someone. A heretic could just, leave town and go share that somewhere else, or he could stick around and fight you out there. There's no official governing body in place in this time. There's no, in our judicial system, right, appeals courts and Supreme Courts, there's none of that stuff in early church history, of course. Bishops were the final authority in their own territory, and you could get a regional council of bishops together, but that was about it. And of course, if someone doesn't want to listen to a bishop, what's he supposed to do about it, right? He doesn't have any authority to actually implement that. They could throw you out of the church, but that's about it. The Orthodox view of Christianity, therefore, the right, correct belief about Jesus and who he was and what he's doing, can only have triumphed over heretical versions by being the more popular belief, by being the belief that people accepted and the one that was more well accepted. And truth be told, it was always the majority of those claiming Christ. They were always Orthodox from the time of the apostles all the way through the early councils. We'll talk about why that is in a minute. History shows us that orthodoxy came first, right? We see that with the generation of the apostles and their beliefs and what they wrote down, and the early first bishops, the people that I quoted, all of the things that they wrote that we still have. That is all Orthodox understanding. And later on, you start to see the development as we get into the third, the fourth, the fifth generation of the church. You start to see the development of these different heretical views. They didn't start at the same time. All right, the heresy was a changing of the orthodoxy and not an early competitor of it. Later on, they would begin to try to discredit either Jesus' humanity or his divinity. But of course, the New Testament authors all accepted both, right? Every canonical author that wrote in the New Testament, you can see in their writing, whether it's Paul or James or John or one of the gospel authors, you can see that they believe that Jesus was the Son of God and the Son of Man. There's no gap in that. None of them are unorthodox in that understanding. Non-orthodox writings, they existed, right? Things written by people that portrayed Jesus as not divine or him as not human. They existed, but they were never widely spread, and they never gained prominent usage in the church. Maybe one church here, one church there, or a couple of churches, but they were never widespread. Not on any scale to compare with Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, with the writings of Paul, etc., etc. The Orthodox view of Jesus is enshrined in our oldest extant manuscripts. All right? Our oldest manuscripts that we still have, that still exist, predate the 4th century councils, and we'll talk about those councils in a little bit, by more than 150 years. So 150 years before the councils, Constantinople and Nicaea and all of that, we have manuscripts of portions of the New Testament that have an orthodox understanding of who Jesus is. And copies of those texts were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. So therefore, it is impossible that anyone could have gathered them all together and changed the Gospel of John in, 200 spots to add that Jesus is divine. Because that's about how many times you could get that from the Gospel of John. I'm exaggerating, but it's like everywhere. It's impossible that somebody found every copy of the Gospel of John and added that when we get to the Council of Nicaea, because it's already been spread throughout the empire and beyond for more than 150 years. If that were true, we would have copies of the Gospel of John that survive that portray Jesus as just a man. It would have been buried in the desert somewhere. It would be found in a jar, and you would look at it, and it would read just like the Gospel of John, except for all those places where Jesus says, I am, and all of that, they wouldn't be in there. And it would blow everyone's mind, and you'd be like, oh, they added this later. But guess what? That has never, ever, ever been found. We have never found a version of any canonical text that portrays Jesus differently. No different version of Ephesians, no different version of 1 John. Pick your text, right? No such thing like that has ever been found. Of course, they don't exist. Long before there was an official church council, before there was something like an official church, right? Before there were creeds, orthodoxy was established. Now that is, I make a big deal about this because Bart Ehrman has made a career in recent decades of promoting the idea that the New Testament was written by the winners. That the way the New Testament reads now reflects orthodoxy that only emerged in the 4th century. But it's impossible for the reasons we outlined there. Number one, because the texts predate that. Number two, because we've never found a version of one of those texts that says that kind. We found texts in the desert and elsewhere that portray Jesus as just a man or portray Jesus as divine but not with a human body. But they're completely different gospels. The Gospel of the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary. They put, of course, famous names on them for a reason. The church never used them. They're much later than the original Gospels, and they're certainly not a version of those Gospels. They're a completely different thing. So Bart Ehrman likes to say that when the church began, it was anybody's game. That there were all sorts of ideas about Jesus floating around out there, and just as many people believed he was not human or not divine as believed that he was human and divine. But that's an entire argument from silence, because there's actually no evidence of that. You're saying that all the evidence has been cleared up and hidden and disappeared, but that's like saying they faked the moon landing. That you don't have evidence is not evidence. Right? Unless you're a conspiracy theorist, which of course it can't help you if that's the way you're going. Where then are the versions of the Gospels where Jesus is just a man? Where are the non-orthodox writings that portray, or excuse me, the non-orthodox writings that exist? And we have found a few. The Nag Hammadi writings were found in the desert more than 100 years ago, and we didn't know what these things actually said until they found copies of them. We have bishops from the 2nd to 3rd century writing against these things and saying that thing's messed up, don't believe that, right, to another church. We've got letters like that, but we didn't actually have the text until they found some in modern history. If you want to learn more about that topic, here's my last book to recommend for today. And this one's really quite good. It's called The Heresy of Orthodoxy, which is a fascinating title. Kostenberger and Kruger, a pair of guys whose names start with K, they delve deeply into this topic of whether or not the early church was orthodoxy and heresy in equal measure, or if it was mainly orthodoxy with a little heresy. Ehrman would tell you the first. They're showing you evidence for the latter, but it's a good book. That one came out in 2010. So what are these heresies that we're talking about? What did they believe that the later councils would be wrestling with? Well, the first one is a group of heresies denying the deity of Jesus. Now, fascinatingly, most of the early heresies the church struggled with were about who Jesus is. They weren't about other stuff. They were about, is he human? Is he divine? And the first group of heresies were that he's not divine. Later on, we've got people saying that he wasn't human. So one group that said that were the Ebionites, the Ebionites, and this was a Jewish movement that declared that, yes, indeed, Jesus is the Messiah, but not divine, and there's no virgin birth. The only New Testament scripture that they would adhere to was the Gospel of Matthew, but of course they had to start at chapter 4. Because the first three chapters aren't working for them. No genealogy, no birth narrative, none of that stuff. And they wanted to bring the idea of Jesus as the Messiah and combine him with Jewish rites and rituals, which of course the Apostle Paul rejects that and says, no, we're not still doing circumcision, we're not doing kosher laws, that's not the way it works. They thought that Jesus' brother James, the head of the Jerusalem church, was the man, and they thought Paul was an apostate. Of course, they didn't like Paul. We first hear about them in the 2nd century. A much bigger group would be those revolving around Arianism. And don't get confused with the racial Aryan thing. This has nothing to do with Hitler and the Aryans. That's completely just a coincidence of the sounding. It's not even spelled the same. Arius, A-R-I-U-S, is the man's name. He lived from 256 to 336, and he was a Christian priest. His church was in Alexandria, and he began teaching that the Son had a beginning. Here's his quote: "If the Father begat the Son, there was a time when the Son was not." That's the heresy that he's promoting. It becomes known as subordinationism, because, we need a big word for it. And so he would say that the Son, or the Logos, the Word, is the highest of the created order, but inferior to the Father, created by the Father. And if that sounds familiar, maybe you've had a conversation with a Jehovah's Witness. Because that's exactly what the Jehovah's Witnesses are saying. They are promoting the heresy of Arianism or subordinationism. They're just recycling it 2,000 years later. He was exiled by his bishop, the Bishop of Alexandria, but he went he went east and north of there, and his teaching was accepted. Because of him, we end up with the Council of Nicaea. We'll get to that in a minute. After that council, he was exiled, although he was restored by Constantine. Constantine gave him a chance. He said, you can give up most of what you claimed before, and you can come back or not. And the guy said, okay, I'll back off of my most strident and controversial tones. Asking me the question, is Arius in heaven? Probably. He was a man who believed in Jesus. He struggled to try to figure out who he was, and he walked away from his heresies at the end of his life. Seems like he would be. Like many another person from history that struggled but found their way home in the end. Arianism was revived in the eastern half of the empire under the Emperor Constantius II and the Emperor Valens, but was eventually wiped out 379 to 395 by the Emperor Theodosius I. So it's going to have a big era, as it were, in the East, and then be completely shut down. The Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople is the end of Arianism in the East. In a weird note, in the West, Arianism found a home among the Goths and the Vandals, right? These Germanic tribes that invaded Rome and conquered the empire and shattered it, they liked Arianism because it appealed to, it melded well with their pagan beliefs. And so an Arian version of Christianity was very easy for them to accept. And it took until the 8th century for Christian missionaries and priests and bishops and whatnot to kind of finally weed that out of those people groups. So you've got people denying the deity of Christ, and then the flip side, you have people denying the humanity of Jesus. Yep. The first of which would be under the Greek philosophy of Docetism. That is the belief that the historic and bodily existence of Jesus is a semblance. It doesn't have a true reality. In other words, that flesh of Jesus that you're talking about, that's just an illusion. Okay? Yes, he's divine, but the man part is fake. It's like some kind of optical illusion kind of thing, some kind of magic. He's not really here. We first encounter this in a letter by Bishop Serapon of Antioch, 197 to 203. He found a Christian community in southwest Turkey who were using the Gospel of Peter. That's one of those texts that I told you about. And we found a fragment of that in the Egyptian desert in 1886. Until then, we didn't know what it actually contained. The synods of Rome in 382 and Carthage in 397, among other, officially condemned the Gospel of Peter and said, no. Very few churches are using this, but it's definitely not orthodox anyway, and we need to condemn it. So what did they have to say? Well, they had two different ways of talking about Jesus. One was to say that he was too divine to inhabit a human body. God can't have a body, so the body must be an illusion. Okay? So their view of God is so high that he can't possibly be one of us. The other way they talked about it, different groups using this philosophy, would say that yes, Jesus was a real man, but Christ is the divine nature that enters into him at the baptism when the dove comes down, and it leaves him on the cross. Therefore, when he cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, that is the man Jesus saying, what happened to my spirit? It's gone. And so they would say that divine was with Jesus and then leaves Jesus. So they got two different ways of talking about it that make his nature less than the combination of God-man. The Council of Nicaea, if you know the Nicene Creed that will later come out of that, spends a lot of time making sure that they say, no, none of that, right? And reject it wholeheartedly. The other idea from which people are rejecting the humanity of Jesus is what we know as Gnosticism. It is a Greek philosophical idea of a dualistic nature of reality. In other words, in their philosophical understanding, nature itself is both spirit and matter, and they don't mix. All right? This is a movement outside of Christianity that gains credence in the first century, the second century. You can actually see John writing against it in 1 John when he talks about Jesus Christ coming in the flesh, when he says that which we have seen, that which we have heard, right? He is writing against them. That's what we call that proto-Gnosticism. It wasn't fully developed when John wrote, but it was coming. And that Greek philosophy becomes melded onto Christianity in some communities, and they start believing that. When Paul went to the Areopagus in Athens in Acts 17, they were listening to him, right? Until he said what? This man whom God raised from the dead. The moment he talked about a bodily resurrection, they laughed, because they had this dualistic view of reality that said the flesh is evil, the spirit is good, and if you die, you're free. Why would any God, punish someone by putting them back in the flesh again? That wouldn't have been a victory, that would have been a defeat in their mind. Now, of course, Paul can't get through that in one telling to explain why they've got that wrong and how they got it backwards. They believed that the world wasn't actually created directly by God, but what they called an emanation. In other words, God creates something that creates something that creates something, and then that creates the world. Because God is spiritual and pure, and he couldn't directly create a world like this that has fallen matter and evil and all of the stuff in it. So they made a whole bunch of steps between God and creation. That's a funky answer. That's an interesting way to talk about the problem of evil and to explain why this world is flawed even though God is not. Versions of Gnosticism connected to Christianity would be exampled by Platonism. The Greek philosopher Plutarch wrote about Platonism. He lived from 45 to 127, and it will be very influential upon the early church. So one of the things that you learn as you study the early church is how much Greek philosophy influenced early Christianity. Some of it for the good, and some of it for the worse. And this is for the worse, because this is viewing matter, flesh, our bodies as evil inherently. Not because of what we do, but because they're fleshly. All right, this is not a Pauline discussion of flesh, right? When Paul is talking about the flesh, he's talking about our sinful nature. He's talking about what we inherit because of our rebellion and our sin. They would talk about it in terms of this actual stuff that our body, these atoms, they wouldn't know that word, that our bodies are made out of. And this dualistic way of thinking, then, would say that bodily functions are inherently bad. Eating, drinking, sex, all of these things that we must do to live and procreate the species, they're all bad. And they really should be shunned. And so you get a lot of asceticism, you got a lot of self-denial coming out of this. This is not something that the church gets from Judaism. Judaism has none of that would say that eating, drinking, and procreation are inherently flawed. That you don't get that at all from Judaism. It's all from Greek philosophy that gets melded in. So if you ever wondered, where did the church get that from? The biggest answer is from Greek philosophy. A lot of other things Greek philosophy gave the church were very helpful, but that is not one of them. Questions about those heresies? We'll talk about the councils in the next moment. So those are the two main things. Now later on, the church will start arguing about other things, but the two main things that people are arguing about in that period between the eyewitnesses and Constantine are the humanity of Jesus and the deity of Jesus. Because, of course, they're both complicated topics, right? I mean, the incarnation is not an easy topic, and very important topics. You can't not argue about it if someone is promoting a non-divine Jesus or a non-human Jesus, and you're a priest or a bishop. You got to do something about that. You can't say, "Oh, you silly people," because it's a very important topic. So, how did the church handle that long term? And here is where we get the early councils. Our third of four segments, we're behind schedule, but maybe we'll make it, you never know. Where does the need for the ecumenical councils come from? So that transition period between persecuted church and imperial church that we talked about earlier left division in its wake. I told you we'd come back to this topic. We've got that ongoing question of the lapsed Christians, those who had succumbed to persecution and did not remain defiant. The new emperor, Constantine, is like, hey, I don't want squabbles in my church. All right, he's already thinking of it that way because, of course, he's the emperor. Because he believed that he won the war because God liked him. And God was happy with him. And he wasn't going to screw that up. He's like, I want to stay emperor, right? I want my son to be emperor after me, all of that kind of thing that emperors and kings care about. He says, I don't want a squabbling church. So I'm going to put an end to this fight. It's easier said than done. Because in North Africa, we have developing what becomes known as the Donatist controversy. So we've got the Bishop of Carthage, a man named Cecilian, who was rejected by the supporters of his rival Donatists. All right? So the new bishop in Carthage, the people said, we don't want him. We want this other guy, and Donatist was the hardliner. Donatist was the guy who was like, ain't nobody getting forgiveness for lapsing. unless they come before me on their hands and knees kind of thing, right? He was the tough guy. Cecilian was the one that was appointed that was for forgiving people, and they're butting heads about that. Now, interestingly, Cecilian was supported by the Bishop of Rome. That's something that had started happening. 256 AD, it's before this a little bit, was the very first time we see the Bishop of Rome writing someone an answer to a controversy, to a decision, and he says, hey, I'm the successor of Peter. Matthew 16:18. They didn't have the chapters and numbers yet, but he quotes that and says, hey, you got to do what I tell you. That's the first time the bishop in Rome said, I'm special, I'm not like everybody else. That will, of course, later on develop into the papacy, but we saw that in 256. Now the bishop in Rome is trying to put his man in Carthage, but the locals don't want any piece of it. Constantine twice called a council of bishops. He said, all right, 313, 314 AD, right after he became emperor, he's like, you guys fix this thing in North Africa. I don't want this. And they couldn't do it. Council of bishops, no, locals didn't want to listen to them either. After the second one failed, he orders the Donatist leaders to return to the church, and he says, you know who's going to enforce this? My guys right here with spears. This is the first official Christian persecution of other Christians with governmental authority behind it. And how long did it take to occur after governmental authority was in the hand of a Christian? 2 years. It only took 2 years for the whip hand to go from persecuting Christians to being used by Christians to persecute other Christians. It's a bad sign. Or I see that as a bad sign for things to come. We're eventually going to be talking about the Inquisition and the Crusades, right? So you know where we're heading with this. It only took 2 years. But even with the army, most of the Donatists never returned to the official church. It didn't work. And this controversy in North Africa will never heal. This is the 4th century. In the 7th century, when the Islamic armies show up, they're still at each other's throats. So they kept this argument up, this fight over who the rightful bishop is and whether or not people can be forgiven. They kept it going for more than 4 centuries. That makes the Hatfields and McCoys look like amateurs, right? But we've got a couple of principles established in this fight. Number one, the idea of using a church council to resolve a dispute. It didn't work, but they tried to use it, and so that will become something in the future. The power of the bishops to themselves take it upon themselves. This will become important later because the Roman Empire is about to fall, and the bishops are going to be on their own without any government to give them direction real soon. So let's look at the councils that arise in this era. The first one you've heard of, the Council of Nicaea, AD 325. We talked about the Alexandrian priest named Arius with his subordinationism, with his doctrine that Christ is inferior to the Father. I told you that he was condemned by a synod of Egyptian bishops, which is a gathering of Egyptian bishops in 318. However, the bishop of Nicomedia, a man named Eusebius, not the famous historian, but a man named Eusebius, welcomed Arius and said, I like what you're selling, and his ideas continued to spread and take root. Well, Constantine, he's still around, says, you know what, that isn't going to work. I want an end to this. I want you to summon a council of bishops, and we're going to end this once and for all. So they brought them to Nicaea, and here's his quote. I will be present as a spectator and participator in the things which will be done. So in other words, Constantine told the bishops, when you all get here, I'm just going to keep an eye on things, and we're going to solve this. He's the emperor. They're going to take it seriously. So this council is going to be about its business. the Nicene Creed will eventually come out of this council, not the final form. That's the Council of Constantinople will actually give us the Nicene Creed. It's a little bit of a misnomer in that respect. But what they decided at Nicaea is what they eventually wrote at Constantinople. So we still call it the Nicene Creed. And their biggest resolution was that the Son is of one substance with the Father. Now, of course, substance is an English word, and so they didn't use that. They used the Greek word homoousis, which doesn't mean anything to you, but homo, you know that prefix. It means one or same, and ousis is substance. So one substance, same substance. They used that to talk about it. There were 318 bishops at the Council of Nicaea. That's a big group. 316 voted in favor of that resolution. All right? Pick a church that has 300 bishops, right, in today, and you are not getting 316 out of 318 to agree on anything. I can't think of a resolution you could get that kind of unanimity about. This was the first truly ecumenical council, and by that we mean that it had geographic ecumenism. They had people from Spain and North Africa and Egypt and Italy and Asia Minor. They had bishops from all over the Christian church, and they had unprecedented attendance at this. For the next half century, then they will be arguing, what does this homoousis mean? What does this actually mean? How do we put this, further into our understanding? And the man who will champion that is Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria. This will be the term that he uses to beat down the Arians and the semi-Arians, the people that believed in Arius's lesser version of Jesus. And he will come up with this way of saying it. The Trinity is three equal hypostases in one ousia. We'll use English. Three equal persons in one substance or one essence. Now that is a practical distinction, but it is a little more arbitrary in Greek or Latin than it is in English. Because in English, there's a pretty good distinction between a person and a substance, right? But they're actually, hypostasis and ousia are synonyms. In Greek, and the Latin version words they used for it were also synonyms of each other. So they're trying to wrestle with putting the mystery of the incarnation into actual human words that everybody can agree upon, right? How do we explain that Jesus is the same as God, but has his own personhood, right? That you need a couple of words to get that figured out, right? It's not it's a mystery, and it takes some time. Eventually, then the Arian party, those supporting that idea, will fade from the church. And like I said, we don't really see it again until the Jehovah's Witnesses in any significant number. And based on the world's population of Christians today, even if you considered them to be Christians, they would be 1/10 of 1/100th of a percent or whatever, right? Just a tiny amount. So Arianism, for all intents and purposes, is gone after these councils. The second council is the Council of Constantinople in 381, called by the Emperor Theodosius. And here we have the Nicene Creed in its final form that is put together. And that creed will be used in the East and the West from that point on. It's one of the very few things that East and West will continue to be able to agree on after the Great Schism, which we'll cover next week. And the Armenians, who are outside of the empire, and the Syrians, who are outside of the empire, will accept it. Almost everyone. We'll talk about the holdovers eventually, but there are very few at all holdovers of the Nicene Creed. It is as universal a thing as we have in church history, right? If you say, what can we agree upon? And if you're Protestant, if you're Orthodox, if you're Catholic, about the only thing that we've got, right, is the Nicene Creed in terms of a detailed belief statement, right? We could say we all believe in Jesus, but you gotta give me more than that, right? Something a little more detailed than that. But Nicene Creed, we're like, yep, everybody's on board. That council outlawed Arianism, but they also outlawed the subordinationism of the Holy Spirit. They realized, wait a minute, Father and Son, we've made it clear that the Son's not subordinate, that he's not lesser than the Father, but what about the Holy Spirit? Eventually, people started getting around to that heresy, and so they're like, we got to put an end to that one. And so they outlawed that as well. If you're wondering about the Apostles' Creed, that's from the West. The Apostles' Creed was not part of the Ecumenical Council, but it basically says almost all the same things as the Nicene Creed. It's just a Western creed. The Eastern Church wouldn't have an issue with it, but it's not theirs. All right, so we've had 70 years since the Edict of Milan in 313 that made Christianity legal, right? In 381, it became official. And at this point in history, the church has a monopoly status. In other words, all of the ancient priesthoods, the Greek, the Egyptians, all of these religions that had privileges in society, they had special statuses and legal protection, all of that is gone now after Constantinople. And they start destroying those temples. Now, archaeologists, right, art historians are like, don't do that. But they demolish them, smash the statues. That's why very few of that stuff survives to the modern world. And sadly, the Olympic Games ended in 393 because they were too connected to Greek worship, pagan worship, for them to keep being held. And they won't be held for, a long time after that. Also at this time, non-Christians are banned from serving in the army, in the government, or at the court of the emperor. And so we're seeing a change, right? We talked about that. In a short period of time, from being outlawed to being favored, and now the disfavor is on the non-Christians. And you start to see that. And this is a dangerous thing that we see in church history, that when Christians have the power to punish the people they disagree with, whether they're other Christians or non-Christians, they unfortunately make use of it. And we see this at this point in the empire's history. We got to keep moving. We got one more council and then one more topic, so we are in the home stretch. The last council is the Council of Chalcedon, 451, so we're fast forwarding a little bit. And now we're finally talking about the humanity of Jesus, right? Nicaea and Constantinople was nailing down the divinity. Now we're talking about the humanity of Jesus. And here's the question. We've got a divine nature, we've got a human nature, and they're both contained in one vessel, right? In that man walking around Jesus. But how does that work? Are they, and here's the two analogies they came up with, are they like wine and water? If you pour them into the same vessel, you can't tell them apart anymore, right? The molecules all mixed together, and they're neither water or wine anymore. It's watered down wine, but I mean, they're one thing. Or are they like oil and water? You can put them in one jar and they swirl around, but they don't actually mix, and they could be separated back out again. Of course, if you let it sit, they'll separate. Which one is it? And the answer is yes, something like that, right? So, but they wanted to know. This was being pushed forward because during this time, Mary was being hailed as the Theotokos, which is Greek for the God-bearer, the one who gave birth to God. All right? Why? Well, because those that were putting forth the Nicene Creed and talking about the divinity of Jesus wanted to emphasize that part of the virgin birth and the incarnation, and a man named Nestorius, who was actually Bishop of Constantinople, so a very important man, he attacked the title of Theotokos. He said the Word of God is the creator of time. He is not created within time. So in other words, he thought that that was impinging upon the deity of Jesus by talking about Mary as the one who gives birth to God, using that terminology. He thought it was insulting to Jesus. And of course, in the East, you now have turmoil, and people are arguing about this and whether or not they could use that term for Mary. And so the Emperor Theodosius II says, all right, sit down. We got to have a council of Ephesus. It's not an ecumenical council. It's just in the East. And Nestorius and Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria, the two main proponents on these sides, are forced to come up with a compromise, but it ruins Nestorius. And that term, Theotokos, comes out of the Council of Ephesus, and people are like, no, you can keep calling her that. However, politics being what there was a palace coup. Theodosius dies, and the new queen is his sister. Her name is Pulcheria, and she is a bitter foe of the people that had won at Ephesus. And those who believed in a strong emphasis on one nature, sort of the water and wine people. She was a bitter foe of them, and she called a council at Chalcedon, and that's the one we're talking about, to get things back under control, at least in her way of thinking. And this is the formula they came up with. So it was a bumpy road to get here, and not the most useful one, but what they ended up with is good. So we'll focus on that. And they said Jesus is, and this is the term the Catholic Creed has gone back to using, that Jesus is consubstantial with the Father as regard his divinity, and the same consubstantial of one substance, right, of same substance, with us regarding his humanity. And to this day, that is the formulation that Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant could all agree to. That he's the same essence, the same substance of the Father, of God, when we're talking about his divinity, and the same substance, the same essence, when we're talking about humanity, as us. Same. As much God, as much human as us, right? That's what they came up with. So that vindicated Nestorius, the distinction that he said, the distinction of the natures being in no way abolished because of the union. And so here's what Nestorius was trying to say, right? That when you combine the humanity and the divinity together in Jesus, you're not hurting either one of them, right? He doesn't lose either the humanity or the divinity. He keeps all of both. Eventually, you arrive at a mystery, right? Well, how does he do that? I don't know. There's only one of him, right? He's the God-man. No one else has been this. And it's an example of one. It's hard. Eventually, we end up running out of words. The sad thing is that even though the Council of Chalcedon vindicated Nestorius, it condemned him personally as a heretic, even though his view is what they accepted. That's just mean. But he wasn't there to defend himself because he died 2 days before an invitation to come to the council arrived at his house. He was old. It happens. But previously, when we had the Council of Nicaea, we didn't have hardly anyone, any notable groups that disagreed with the Nicene Creed. The Council of Chalcedon, not so much. All right, we've got two groups that still exist to this day that said we don't buy that. One was called the Diophysites. These terms are so great. Easier to call them Nestorians. They wanted an even more firm definition of the two natures. In other words, they wanted to make sure that when we're talking about oil and we're talking about water, that you get that they don't mix. They primarily lived in Syria, and there are Diophysite Christians, there were a significant group of Diophysite Christians in Syria until the Syrian Civil War. Just now, in recent history, there's not many left because, of course, millions of people have fled that country because of Assad's insanity. The monophysites, the one nature people that wanted them more firmly talked about as mixing, the water and wine people that wanted that emphasized, were in Egypt, and we have a name for them. They're called Coptics. All right, the Coptic Christians in Egypt that started worshiping in their own language is what that name comes from, the Coptic. They were in Egypt all the way until just now, and they had a thriving community until the recent struggles in Egypt, but they're still there. When you hear about a church bombing in Egypt, or a massacre or whatever, unfortunately, which we've seen, right, in the last 10 years, those are almost always Coptics, C-O-P-Ts. That's hard to enunciate in English. Both of those groups end up surviving and really getting lost to mainstream Christianity. We forget about them because of Islam, right? The borders of Islam will swallow them up a few centuries later, and the Christians in the Orthodox and Catholic Christians in the East and the West will basically lose track of them. But they'll still be there. All right, quick pause for questions. We got 22 minutes and one more segment to go. This is going to be a race to the finish.
I have a question.
Yes.
The decision at Council
Mm-hmm.
where Christ is
Consubstantial.
with
Of
God and with humanity.
yes.
You had mentioned earlier, I just want clarification. I knew
Sure.
this, but when Christ was on the cross, he said those words. He said, my divinity's left.
Well, that's what not the other people, not the Ebionites. That was where was I? That's the Docetists, right? Those are the heretics that denied the humanity of Jesus. So that's not an Orthodox view that the divinity of Jesus leaves at the cross. That's what they said. All right. So Chalcedon is just trying to solve how do we actually explain the humanity and divinity of Jesus in that one vessel? What are the words that we can use to describe that? Everybody agreed that he had both at that point, right? Because of Nicaea. Nobody was saying he wasn't divine. Nobody was saying he wasn't human. They were all just trying to figure out which, are they mixed? Are they still distinct? Is it permanent, right? They had a lot of questions. And again, these are good questions, right? You start reading about the incarnation, you go, wait a minute. How does this thing work, right? What's going on here? There's a lot of questions that need answering. So it's no wonder that the early church wrestled with these things, right? This is not a bug. This is how it should have been. They needed to wrestle with these mysteries in order to sort of mark the boundaries of what was acceptable orthodoxy about them, so that people could understand. And they needed to be very technical discussions. They needed to be very detailed discussions because of the nature of the conversation. All right. One more, and then we're good for session one. And that is the only person who gets his own segment. Woo woo, St. Augustine. And you'll see the reason why, because his influence towers above anyone else. There is no one in church history who is more influential than St. Augustine, whose name is not Jesus or Paul. If you're lining up the most influential people in the history of Christianity, you go Jesus, Paul, Augustine. And then after that, if this is Mount Rushmore, number 4, everybody's going to be arguing about who it is. But 1, 2, and 3 are set in stone. So let's talk about him. He lived from 354 to 430. All right, so that period after Constantine, towards the councils, that's his era. He lived in North Africa. He was a Latin-speaking theologian. Interestingly enough, he didn't really know Greek. He didn't care about Greek. He didn't care about Greek philosophy, but he actually was heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, which is a variation of the philosophy of Plato, which of course is a Greek philosopher. So he was a Greek thinker without even knowing it, without reading the Greeks. He absorbed it anyway. That's how prevalent it was in the ancient world, by the way. His parents sent him to school in Carthage. where he was drawn to the literature and philosophy of Rome. And of course, the Romans stole everything from the Greeks in terms of their literature and philosophy. He had a son with his long-term mistress, and he had a career as a teacher of rhetoric. But he was plagued with anxiety. He walked around saying, where does evil and suffering in this world come from? I have to have an answer to this. I don't get it. Where does it come from? What is the rationale for it? For the first 9 years of his career, he was what we call a Manichaeist. And a Manichaeist is a dualist, someone who believes that good is eternal and evil is eternal, and that's just the way nature is. All right, it was a version of that Gnostic dualism we were talking about before. This was a religious version of that, but he became disillusioned with it. And he said, that's not the answer. That can't be the right answer. As he went on, he was fascinated by the bishop of Milan, a man named Ambrose, a very brilliant Christian thinker. He was the only Christian thinker that Augustine, long before he's St. Augustine, right? He's just Augustine, that he respected. He said, this guy's smart. All right, and so he listened to him more, and he got to know him and interacted with him. And he started thinking about becoming baptized and becoming a Christian. And interestingly enough, his mother had been praying about this for him since he was a child. And so this is one of those stories of a mom who prays for her child to become a Christian for their whole life. But he hesitated. He didn't want to take the plunge. In 385, with his mother still going after him, he broke up with his mistress. He had been with her for 15 years. They had a child together, and he put her away because his mother said, you got to settle down and have a good marriage, right? A respectable marriage. And so he eventually said, okay, I'll do it. But in the middle of this attempt to change, he had a personal crisis. He read Romans 13:13-14. Let me just quickly read it to you. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. That ripped him apart, of course, because of his mistress, because of his past more riotous behavior in his youth. He had what we would call a conversion experience, and that brought him liberation from all of that torment about evil, about good, and all of that he'd been struggling with for years and years. But here's a lesson. His mother had prayed hard on this man, but he went further than what she wanted. He said, sorry, Mom, I can't marry the girl. I'm going to take a vow of celibacy. So he went from debauchery to celibacy. When he went in hard. And this, of course, is a feature of St. Augustine. He was an all-in kind of guy. And his definition of original sin will be influenced, I believe, by his life and his experience. Because for St. Augustine, original sin will be inextricably linked to the sexual act. The way that original sin becomes transmitted from one generation to another, according to St. Augustine, is in procreation. Hence, in part, his vow of celibacy. And this will have a massive consequence on the Western Church. Not the Eastern Church, because he's not a big influence there, but in the Western Church. When we talk about gender roles, when we talk about marriage, when we talk about celibacy, when we talk about the idea of sex within marriage, you ever wonder where that idea comes from in the Western Church, that even sex within marriage has a dirty element to it? Thanks St. Augustine for that. That traces back to him primarily. Now, that comes from Greek philosophy as well that he absorbed without even knowing it, but he's the one that made it a part of church thinking for the next 1,600 years. These ideas are still out there, and they trace back to St. Augustine. One of the reasons why we're talking about him is that when we talk about sexual ethics in the church today, we're still having some of the same arguments that were influenced by St. Augustine. His biggest influences were as a bishop. I'm sorry, I forgot to do that one. I'll leave that one up there for a few minutes. case someone at home wants to write some of that down. My mistake, I missed a click there. Oh, yes, I did. I looked right past it and didn't do it. His biggest impacts then as a Christian are as a bishop and as an author. In 391, he will visit the struggling Catholic Church in Hippo. That would be the Christians that were aligned with Rome, not the Donatists. Remember that controversy? This is the third time we're talking about them. They convinced him to stay and become their priest, and when the next time for a bishop to came around, they said, you should really actually just be our bishop too. So he became the bishop of Hippo, and he will stay in that position until he dies. The Catholic Church in North Africa was the minority. The Donatists were in the majority. This is a century after that big fight, and it's still going strong. The Donatists had remained pure during persecution and proclaimed that the church is a gathering of a pure community. The church can only be the pure, they said. And here's where Augustine is right. Augustine disagrees strongly with them. He says, no. The church is not pure, not for the pure. The church is for those who are trying to be pure. Not for those who are already pure, but for those that are heading there. In other words, are we a gathering of saints or are we a gathering of redeemed sinners? And Augustine said, no, we're just a bunch of sinners saved by grace, and we're doing the best we can, but we are not the pure. All right? And thank you, St. Augustine, for sticking up for that, because otherwise we'd all feel real bad, right? We wouldn't be able to go to church. It'd be an empty place. After later negotiations with the Donatists failed, Augustine actually supported the idea of forcing them back into the church. Remember, we talked about that force used against them. This is at a later period, but Augustine was in favor of that. And weirdly, he thought the parable of the banquet was the reason why. When in the parable, Jesus says, compel them to come to my banquet, the people to fill it up, he said that means the government has the right to compel the church to behave itself and the heretics to cut it out. He actually believed the Christian government had the duty to support the church by punishing heresy and schism. Now that is an idea that today's Christian nationalists would be like, bravo, bravo, right? Use the government to punish the people we disagree with in the church, all right? That's also an idea that any Baptist worth their salt is going, no, not that. All right? So when Augustine is hugely influential, but I don't nearly agree with everything the man said, right? His sexual theology is tainted by that bad understanding. His idea of the government and its role in the church is something that made a lot of sense in his day, but man, we don't like it now. Or at least I don't, because we, later on, have seen the Inquisition, right? We have seen this reach its fulfillment. We've seen heretics burned at the stake. We've seen the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, and we know what happens when the church has an army. Obviously, Augustine didn't know all of that because he was living when there was only one empire, so things were much different. But everything he writes that influences the church later, he writes as a pastor trying to solve problems in his church. Not someone sitting in a proverbial ivory tower. He's actually trying to solve problems. He is the one who will develop an understanding of the Trinity that we use and talk about in the West. And in order to bolster the equality of the Spirit, they began asserting that the Son participated in the Spirit proceeding from the Father. It's called the Filioque, that part in the Nicene Creed, that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. They don't say that in the East, because that's not a part of the original Nicene Creed. It was added in the West because people were doubting some issues about the Holy Spirit and the Trinity, and they were trying to solve that. So what is he known for? He is known for two works primarily. One of them is called the Confessions, and this is a huge narrative where basically he's just writing out his prayer journal. What are the things that you're wrestling with in prayer, Augustine? And it's influential because it was real. And writers didn't write like that back then. They didn't write about their own feelings and their struggles and whatnot, right? They were much more academic in the way they approached these things. And he just laid it all out. He just puts it all down on paper, the things he's wrestling with and the ideas that he's struggling with, like he's talking to God. Right, like David does in the Psalms, right? David is just wrestling with ideas. You can see that in some of the Psalms. So it's very real, and it has a lot of influence there. He also writes the city of God. In 410, Rome is sacked. It's not the end of Rome, but the city itself is sacked by a barbarian army, and it rocked the world. People were like, how can this happen, right? How can Rome be vulnerable? So for 13 years, he writes about this and wrestles with this idea of evil. And he comes up with an answer that I very, very much like, and I use this one all the time, this explanation. Evil is non-existence. God being the only source of life and light and reality, sin is moving away from that. And if you move away from God, you move to nothingness. You move away from life. You move away from light. You're not moving toward anything because there's nothing else out there. Which is, of course, a complete denial of the Manichaeism that he believed as a young man. Right? He believed that evil and good were equally eternal, that they both had a reality. But now he realizes, no. Evil is just a twisting. It's just a marring. It's just a ruining of what God has created. It's not real. Which, of course... here's my one pop culture reference. That's how Tolkien describes in The Lord of the Rings evil as well, as a marring of good. He's the Melkor and Morgoth, or Morgoth and Sauron. They can't make anything. They can only ruin things. In case you wanted to know, I know you love Lord of the Rings just as much as me. Everyone does. In the city of God, he writes that the earthly city glories in itself, the heavenly city glories in the Lord. And he talks about how all human institutions are part of the struggle between the earthly city and the heavenly city. But in a humble understanding, he says not even the church can say that itself is entirely the city of God. We can't go around claiming that we are speaking for God in all things and doing everything right. All right? So he posits this struggle between the light and the darkness, between God and evil, and yet says we can't say we're always the right. There's some humility in there. But much of his influence over the next 1,000 years will be when the church says, we are the city of God, and you all that we disagree with are the enemy. Sometimes that's the Holy Roman Emperor. Sometimes that's the King of France. Sometimes that's heretics. But they don't take Augustine the way he wanted to be taken, right? They twist him, and they forget the humility that he brought to it. One more thought, and that is original sin. This is where we will end talking about Augustine and original sin. One of the consequences of the insistence that Jesus is fully human, right? Back that train up. They were talking about that before he came around, was optimism. People started saying if Jesus is fully human, humanity must not be so bad, right? Because why else would he become a human? And there's some truth to that, right? We certainly agree that humanity has inherent value because God created us in his image, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me, et cetera, et cetera. A British monk named Pelagius was concerned that people, now that the church was official and hip, as it were joining the church, rich people, powerful people, but not changing. They joined the church because it was cool now, right? And so he's like, that's not going to work. And so he said, actually, Augustine, what you're saying about original sin is making my job harder to go after them. Because original sin, in his mind, was being used as an excuse. Pelagius said that Christians are saying, hey, I'm fallen. I just can't do it. I can't be better than this. And he said, we got to get rid of this idea of original sin because it's letting people be soft. Pelagius was a modern day, was what we would call a Puritan. He was a hardcore guy that wanted higher moral standards, and he thought that original sin was getting in the way. It wasn't, but that was his understanding. Now, Augustine had developed that idea following Tertullian, who had followed Paul. So it's very Pauline. When you read Augustine talk about original sin, he reads like Paul, which makes sense. Pelagius's followers claimed that Adam's sin was not transmitted to every generation, but that we choose to turn to God through free will. This also echoes a little bit the Calvinist Arminian arguments 1,000 years later, right? Augustine's pessimism regarding human nature started as realism. The reason Augustine was pessimistic about human nature is because he knew people, because he worked with people, and he was like, oh, yeah, my philosophical understandings, my theology fits these people. One of Pelagius's followers, a man named Celestius, said, sin is not born with a man, it is subsequently committed by the man, for it is shown to be a fault not of nature, but of human will. And so they were arguing, is it nature or is it choice? Now the answer is actually both, right? It is in our nature and we choose it. But they were making it like an either-or fight, which of course is sometimes not helpful. So Augustine responded by saying, not simply are human impulses to do good God's grace, but also it is entirely arbitrary on God's part who receives this grace. So in response to Pelagius and in defense of original sin, Augustine starts talking about what we will later call predestination and God's choice of the elect. He describes humanity as a lump of filth. Augustine's crusade against Pelagius was massively successful. He ruined the career of everyone that supported Pelagius in the church. He was completely victorious. But there are unintended consequences, and we will end with this. Unintended consequences of Augustine's crusade on behalf of original sin. As we get into the Middle Ages, we'll start to see this. The increased need on behalf of the people of the church, the increased need in their minds of saints to intercede on their behalf as an intermediary, because they say, we're so messed up, we're so low, we're so fallen, we can't possibly be raised up to where Christ is. We need the saints to help us out. So in their view, original sin is the bigger thing and not grace and not faith. But of course, Augustine writes about grace and faith. They just weren't listening to him about that. The teaching on original sin overpowers the rest of it. When we start seeing penance and purgatory come into the conversation in the 12th century, that is a further development of the influence of Augustine on original sin. I'm in the home stretch. We got one more minute. In 1490 will be printed the first scholarly edition of the completed works of St. Augustine. And people will start reading Augustine all over again. And he will have a huge impact on the Reformation because the reformers will have read him for themselves. Two quotes about Augustine to give you some context. B.B. Warfield, he's a big name all by himself, says, the Reformation, inwardly considered, was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over Augustine's doctrine of the church. In other words, Warfield says the reformers and the papacy were both citing Augustine in their arguments. And it was one theology of Augustine versus another theology of Augustine. That's how influential he was. The writer of this big, thick book, David McCulloch, in his book on the Reformation, which is another 500-page book that I've also got on my shelf, said, from one perspective, over a century of turmoil in the Western Church from 1517, that's Luther, was a debate in the mind of the long-dead Augustine. So the issues he wrestled with and didn't find the full answers to, that's what the reformers are going to spend 100 years arguing about and going to war over and all of that. One last thought. Luther's theology of salvation echoes Augustine, who echoes Paul. And of course, the English evangelicals, men like John Wesley, will read Augustine as filtered through Martin Luther. So you can draw a line from Paul to Augustine to Luther to Wesley and the influence of that. And actually, the Enlightenment, which is an action, right, a counteraction against church theology, is a reaction against original sin as Augustine defined it. The Enlightenment is saying humanity is not that bad, as Augustine said. And so that's another response. You just can't overemphasize, well, I guess you could, but it's hard to overemphasize the impact of St. Augustine on church history and thought on those fundamental levels. Final questions, and then we'll wrap it up. We're 3 minutes over. But hey, I can live with that.
So this Pelagius guy,
Mm-hmm.
like, it sounds like he was on the right track.
Well, Pelagius had the right motive, right? He wanted more ethical behavior on the part of the people. He just went about it by going after a Pauline theology, which is original sin, the idea that every generation is born into sin. He's trying to emphasize human free will so that he can emphasize accountability, right? But he's doing it, so he's ending up in a bad place, not in a heretical place, but just in a poor theological place that didn't work out. And of course, his career and all his friends, Augustine, just because he was that smart and he was that influential, he crushed them on the debate team, as it were. Not that they had a debate team, but the equivalent of that in his writings and speeches and stuff. So, any other closing thoughts? Next time we'll pick it up with monasticism. We'll move into the Middle Ages and end with the Reformation and go from there. So, last thought, last question. Going once, going twice. All right, we'll call that good for tonight. Thank you. Well, let me shut that